So we're going to talk about tips for not overworking your watercolor paintings. And the first thing I want to talk about, borrowing a term from culinary arts, mise en place, which means everything in its place. And this can be geared towards watercolor as well. So mise en place is the idea that we need to have everything ready for making a recipe. You wouldn't start a recipe without your ingredients list and your measurements and your directions. So you need a recipe book. You need all your stuff prepped and ready to go. So the same thing holds true with watercolor. You definitely want to have all your supplies ready. So get yourself some good paper. That's the next thing I'm going to talk about. And you're going to need rags or paper towels. Pick out the brushes that you are going to use for your project. You also want to start your project with a good sketch. So everything should be prepped and ready ahead of time. Now, I do use tape to tape down my paper on a board. That's going to prevent buckling unless you pre-stretch your paper, but who has time for that? I just iron my paper when I'm done my projects. If you want to see how I do that, there's going to be a link in the top of the video here about how to iron paper. You also want clean water, and it's always a good idea to have two. So when your brush is really messy, you can dip it into the first glass, and then to further rinse it, this would be your cleaner water. You also want to prep your paints, what paints you're going to use. So if whatever you're doing requires you to have a pre-mixed area of a certain amount of color and you don't want to run out, you need to do that ahead of time. So, you need to really get your colors done ahead of time. I have some nice little wells here, and if I pre-wet these and get these all nice and juicy, I just want to make sure that I'm not going to run out of my mixtures. And so whatever colors you're going to use, you're going to do that. If you have to do any mixing on your palette, if you want just a little bit of a variation of your orange, you want to have everything done ahead of time. You're going to rinse out your colors and you're going to start fresh. Now, another thing that is a good idea is before you even touch your good project, it's always a good idea to check your swatches of the colors that you want to use on a scrap piece of paper. I do this all the time. In fact, I keep tons of scrap pieces of paper, old projects that didn't work out, or, that I could just reuse the other side of the paper. Always keep scraps of paper. You want to make sure that all your colors go well together before you start your real project. Another thing you could do with scrap pieces of paper is test out different techniques that you're wanting to do. In this here example, this is a really big bleed here. So I was testing out the different dampnesses of my paper with sponge daubers to see the different soft circle shapes that I could get, and then going all the way to dry with paint instead of lifting. So something new I'm practicing and thinking about for some holiday cards. So that'll be in the next videos. So that should be included in all your mise en place start of your watercolor painting. Do your swatches, do your techniques, and make sure that you're efficient at it, that you like the techniques that you're thinking about. You have a good drawing to start with. Your paper is ready. Waters, are ready to go. Your palette is ready to go. So that's the first part about not overworking watercolor. So what's going to happen if we're not prepared and we don't have all this, which I am guilty of that, folks. I do this a lot, is I'll be painting and then I'm like, oh, okay, I need a smaller brush. And then I'm running over to the table and I'm looking for the brush that I want. Meanwhile, my paper is drying. So when I finally get back to my paper using the proper brush that I wanted, my paper's starting to dry, and I might have just wrecked the whole effect that I was going for by not pre-preparing. Now, the second thing that is the most important, and this kind of just goes along with overworking your watercolors. If you use the wrong paper, and I'm talking about student grade paper versus professional paper. Now, don't get me wrong, I was in high school once, and this is the paper that they give you in school, and I didn't even know any better. And I loved watercolor, and you can still have fun with this. But if you're really loving watercolor and you want to get the same effects that you see in, certain tutorials or artists doing, and when I started off my watercolor journey again later in life, I had this paper, or I had versions of just a cheap paper, and I couldn't understand why I wasn't getting some nice effects. So I was doing these feathers. I was getting, very blotchy and overworked, and I was like, "Oh, why is this turning out this way? Why can't I get the effect that this artist is getting?" And she never really told us, but the most important thing is the paper. So she was using Arches paper, and it makes a huge difference when you're doing Arches paper versus student grade paper. So I'll just give you an example here of what this is going to look like when we use these two different papers. I'll just do a couple of little swatches here. I would totally use student grade brushes, student grade paints. The most important thing is the paper, folks. And you can also take your paper and cut it up in smaller pieces. Then you could do little mini sketches and little mini paintings to practice these techniques, to follow along with tutorials. And then when you're really confident and you got that technique down, you want to make a larger size version, you could go with the full paper. I'm going to wet my brushes here. Let's see. And I'm just going to do a couple of swatches just to show you the difference. We'll do a wet on wet swatch. So I'm just going to wet my paper on both sides. Wet here, wet here. And I'm going to use, I just love this transparent pyrrole orange. It's a very bright color, so you'll really get to see the saturation effects here. And I'm just going to drop that in. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Now, one thing I notice when I'm painting is the water sits on the surface more on the student grade, whereas it gets soaked into the paper a little faster on the Arches. And I'm going to do a wet on dry to show you guys the difference as well. So you see how this is one solid color, and I'm getting heavy deposits on the bottom. You can see my brush strokes. It's just, not working out as well as on the Arches. And notice how saturated my colors are versus this. So to get the same color, I'm going to have to go back in there. And I'm going to have to go over it again, hence overworking, right? When you put down a wash, you basically want to put it down and leave it. And the more you fool around and do brush strokes, the worse it's going to look. So to get kind of close to that, I really have to work hard here. Okay, we don't want to work harder, we want to work smarter. So Arches paper or something similar. I also use the Hahnemuhl paper and Beihong paper. Those are my three top choices. I have other artist grade paper that I haven't really played around with too much, which I really need to do to see if I like the other ones I bought too. So now let's do a little splish splash here. I'm going to switch over to, I want to drop in color, and then I want to further wet my paper with the water, and I want to just kind of tilt my paper and see what happens. Now this here is a Hacky brush. It is a natural bristle brush, and this brush, these ones do not shed like some cheap ones that I've I've had before. They're wonderful, and they cover very large surfaces. And even see the way the edges bleed, how pretty that is. I don't have that same effect here. I like to move the watercolor around and kind of let it do its own thing. It's kind of a fun process to see what happens. I know that I just made a big mess here. So I have a really nice soft gradation there. And then instead of brush strokes going from darker to lighter, I just love doing that. I love just letting the water move the paper. Now let's try it on this side. So I kind of have to go back over it to get a nice little edge there. This is definitely softer. You have that really beautiful misty. This is definitely harsher, and it didn't sink into the paper and give me that stain that I'm looking for. This stains so nicely. This paper, not so much. Just to show you guys, if you're, trying to do something and it's not working out, it's probably because of your paper. Now, another thing that we tend to do is use the wrong size brushes. And when we use the wrong size brushes, we're going to be overworking that area because we're going to be over brushing. Okay. So I don't know, like for instance, if I wanted to fill up this circle with some paint, and really I should be using a 12 because I want to be able to get a nice cohesive stain on my circle, and I want it to do it with the least amount of brush strokes. Then it's going to be very bright and beautiful. And as a beginner, I did this all the time, and I used a smaller brush. So if we use a smaller brush, I'll show you what's going to happen here versus a bigger brush. Okay, so yeah, let's compare. Let's do two circles. I'm going to use the smaller brush first, and let's make myself a little bit more of a puddle here so I have enough. But notice to be able to get this completely covered up, I have to really go all the way around here. I'm working harder for one thing, and I am chancing that this part's going to dry before I could even get all of my color in there, which is going to give me hard edges or blooms. Okay, so I see some white spots, and so my circle's not completely saturated. So the more we fiddle, the more we could mar the paper as well. And then, if you're trying to get like little details and you keep going over and over and over, eventually, even though this is cotton paper, eventually you're going to get some imperfections in your paper. And when it dries, it's not going to look right. Now, working with a bigger brush, I could get this same job done in way less time with only a few strokes. And I want to use the whole belly of the brush. So I have some examples of some good paintings and some that I did that I overworked. And some of these are back when I was, just starting in watercolor. So try not to laugh because some of them are really bad. So this is an example of a fresh painting that is not overworked. And it's mostly worked wet on wet with some nice fresh colors and a little bit of detail with a little bit of some wet on dry for just a tiny bit, a hint of detail. I really like this painting. This turned out really nice. Now, when I was just starting watercolor, this is a cellulose paper, so it's not professional grade. And look at my lavender fields. It's like comical to look at how heavy I was with my paint, and it's a horrible painting, but I overworked the heck out of this. I mean, my colors got muddy and it's just a hot mess. So that's not a good painting. This is another one I did as a student and I overworked all of this. This got super muddy. And, you know, this here is not bad. I did pretty good here, but the foliage on the top is not good at all. So that's an example of overworked. Again, when I was a student, this is a great example of bad paper. Now you can see the brush strokes. I don't have any really nice softness. I've got like really hard brush strokes, and it's just not as pretty as it could have been if I was using some professional watercolor paper. This is an example of a very quick painting I did, and this is a good painting that's really not that overworked. Maybe in some of the leaves I was a little heavy-handed with some of the pigment, but the background is just glowing. It's a wonderful background, and I basically sprayed my paper and I dropped in different colors of washes and then used my big paintbrush to get in a couple of details to suggest, you know, a tree trunk here, a tree trunk there. I just love this painting. It's very springy and just makes me smile when I look at it. Okay, this is a very good painting as well. I did save my paper whites in areas to really get the face of the owl glowing. I have a nice soft background, and I did a technique here where when your paper is drying, you can take a damp uh, script liner brush, and when it's damp and the paper's drying, you will get little impressions like this. It's a little tricky. It definitely needs practice because if you have too much water on your paintbrush, you'll end up with a big blob of water and then you'll make a huge bloom. And sometimes blooms are happy accidents. I don't know where that painting is, but I will put it up on the board right now. I do have a picture of it. So this is a robin that I did, and you can see I have a big couple splotches where I was trying to do this technique of drawing with a damp brush, but there was too much water and I got a bloom. And sometimes those are happy accidents and you have to go with it because there's really just no fixing that. And I actually ended up the next day kind of thinking that it gave the painting character and I loved it. Now, this is an example of some good and bad things. I think I might have overworked his belly. I wanted that brightness of the yellow to show through more. And there's a lots of paint strokes here to mimic the feathers. I did some negative painting, and I did a pretty good job of portraying those feathers. And then, of course, the background is really nice and light, and it's fresh and it's very pretty. Again, this could have turned out wonderful, but it is on bad paper. This is just student grade, and it actually ripped my paper when I took the tape off. But notice my hard edges when I was trying to, this is actually wet on wet, and you could hardly notice that that's really, I got back runs and they just didn't feather out pretty at all. Even though it's kind of looks very impressionistic and it's sort of pretty on its own, it wasn't the look I was going for. And then here's another example of one I did that turned out pretty good. The sky I particularly like. Once you get your colors down, you just leave it alone. So those are just some examples on how to identify when a painting is overworked. Another tip for you is try to walk away when you're about 80% done and ask yourself, do I really need to fiddle with it anymore? Go back to it the next day with fresh eyes and you might be surprised. So another tip for you is to make sure that your layers dry completely before starting to do another layer because you could get some muddiness. And here I was actually trying to use some white here to lighten up in front of this dark area, and it did get quite muddy. I also, in this example I showed you before, probably did not let this layer dry before I was going back in here. And, you know, the all these brush strokes didn't turn out as nice as they could have turned out. Again, this is all very worked over way too much, and possibly where it's really muddy is where I was playing with it when I should have let it dry and go back over it with another layer. So my last tip for you is to think about values in your watercolors and how to connect shapes so that your painting flows nicely. So in this very abstract painting here of a forest, I have light coming through the forest. I have all these colors, and I'm trying to make sure that I connecting these big shapes, these big blobs of color, so that it's more of a cohesive painting. If I would have done just individual light rays and not really connect it to the rest of the painting, it would have looked a little disassociated. I think it wouldn't look as fresh. And so you kind of want to connect values and shapes as much as possible. This foreground is nice and soft, but I'm connecting it into the background, you know, so that I'm continuing the color value study. And if I was to draw, you know, this part by itself and then this layer by itself, it wouldn't be soft and it wouldn't flow into one another. So I really do believe in connecting your shapes is a way to make your paintings look fresh and not overworked. In this example of my pumpkins, I have this dark shadows under the pumpkins. And so I wanted to make sure I connected that as well up the sides to try to stabilize the pumpkins in the scene and extend those values into the background so that it kind of flows well together. Same thing with these, you know, I'm connecting all these colors together so that things flow in its own organic way. The more organic you could be with your painting, you know, using the wet on wet techniques, the more charming, if you will. The less brush strokes that we could get away with, the more charming I feel the paintings are. So I hope that helps you guys out. I look forward to hearing your comments, and let me know what you think about this tutorial. Thanks for watching.